The protagonist, standing on the edge of the ship and looking worriedly at the man in front of her, wondered if he could believe her no matter what she told him. But the calm, even overbalanced man, as for such a situation, only replied that he didn't care about it at all. And then the girl thought about his words, and scrutinizing his face, she wondered what it was that bothered him so much. For she knew very well how dangerous trust was. For the deeper the trust, the deeper the wound at the moment of betrayal, and the greater the hatred. And then the young man looked at her carefully and told her that he didn't really care. So he asked Rosen Walker to tell him at least something. But she only looked at him thoughtfully and realized that in that case, she would tell him the truth if he really didn't care. And they met on the same ship at an interrogation, and then the man asked if the girl could lie well, but she calmly informed him that she was not good at it at all. But the calm young man only coolly informed that the paper said something completely different and said that she was skilled in fraud. Persuasion, as well as having a high intelligence and excellent eloquence. There was also a risk of getting caught, so it was necessary to exercise caution when dialoguing with her. But she looked at him calmly and said she didn't understand at all. He only looked at her smiling face and wondered if she had really never lied. Then he said that she had repeated these words during the re-decision as well. But she calmly leaned in close to him with her chair and told him that she was telling the truth, though the judge didn't even try to understand it. And she asked on what piece of paper something like that had been written about her. But he did not answer and stated that she had also repeated these words during her arrest. But she said with a smile that such a remark hurt her. The man did not seem to notice it at all. And that's why when he approached to Rosen Walker, he asked her name. But at that moment, the girl looked at him with a sly smile and wondered why he had asked her. He was not from some miserable backwater, so he must have already known her name. But he calmly looked at her and told her that he was the order of the procedure and asked her what her name was. And she smilingly told him that her name was Rosen Walker. But looking at her smiling face, he asked her to give him another name, because it was not what was stated in the document. But Rosen calmly told him that the name she gave him was the right one. Unable to bear such insolence, the male prisoner leaned back in his chair and said that he was not interested in her real name and needed to know the name she had given earlier and whether it matched the one in his document. Then she looked at her carefully and told her that her name was Rosen Howes. Then she watched as the man began to write something down, and watching Rosen Walker thought that this guy was acting like an ignorant man, and she didn't understand what he was writing down. But then he started reading her biography and said that at the age of 17, she had been sentenced to 50 years of imprisonment of the will and sent to a women's prison, but had escaped after a year. Then also calmly continued that she crossed the cliff and walked naked over the mountain ridge, and 3 months later was discovered and arrested, and added that she was getting an extra 25 sentences for it, and was moved to the prison, Al's high-security cafeteria, but calmly read her file and found that 5 years later she made another escape and successfully hid from the Imperial Army for a year. And it also said that she dug the hole with one spoon. And that's how she escaped from prison. Then, looking at her carefully, he asked if all that was written about her was true, but she said with a smile that it was really true, and asked if the guy wanted to know what she had gone through to get that spoon, since she had to get in touch with a dirty jailer. But he, only lowering his gaze, informed her that he cared absolutely nothing for such details, and the girl was to answer only in substance and to the questions put to her. Rosen Walker just nodded and agreed, then realized that the man in front of her was Connor, a war hero, and even his scowling face looked insanely attractive. This guy was the one whose name was famous all over the world, and she wondered if there was a person in the world who didn't know him by sight. After all, when the planes flew by in honor of the end of the war, leaflets with his image poured from the sky like rain. And at the same moment, when Connor's voice sounded in the sky, broadcast on the radio, all the people raised their heads mesmerized. The government of their empire knew perfectly well how easy it was to actually charm a man. After all, the young noble pilot was the perfect tool. For in the anxiety and despair that war brought with it, the entire population needed Connor. But the next moment, Connor asked her if she understood the reason she was going to the island, the worst prison on Earth. But she calmly said she'd escaped 2 more times, and it was probably because of her that the pride of the Imperial Army had been trampled. But he asked what she'd done besides that got her thrown in jail in the first place, but she calmly said she was innocent. Connor was inexorable, so he looked her over carefully and told her that it was just a formal procedure, and he was not interested in her opinion. But the girl only reiterated that she was really innocent. And then he looked at her file and said, that it's rare for a criminal to be honest about committing a crime. But that stubbornness wouldn't make her conviction go away. But at that moment, Rosen Walker looked at Ian Connor in all seriousness before him and said that his words did not in the least diminish the truth of her innocence. For truth is above assertion, and God knows all things. But faced the equally serious and cold stare of Ian Connor, who informed her that he was not at all concerned with the girl's opinion and ordered her to answer directly. But at that moment, a young man came into the room madly agitated. And immediately from the threshold, he turned to Ian Connor and asked what he was doing here. And he calmly said that they were having a private conversation with the criminal. And then the guy just excitedly asked why he was doing it. But Connor also calmly said that it was the transportation officer's responsibility to study the criminal's identity, and the criminal needed extra attention. But he rubbed the back of his head and said that he understood all this and knew that he was a straightforward man. But he wondered why he was creating extra work for himself. And besides, the worst criminals were sent to the island. And this time it was the famous witch-off, Al's Cafe. But seeing her frantic, the frightened soldier wondered why his commander had called such a dangerous criminal for a private conversation. But he only looked the girl over and wondered, did he really think she was dangerous? But Henry approached and said that even though Rosen Walker looked like a common ragamuffin, you couldn't let your guard down around her. She was a violent criminal who had escaped from Al Cafe's. Then asked if his commanding officer had seen the girl's file. She killed her husband when she was 17 years old. On the protagonist only shudderingly reported that the murder was carried out by 36 stabbings, and the pathologist claimed that the nature of the wounds indicated the perpetrator's hatred for the murdered man. And the perpetrator continued to stab even after her husband had given up his spirit. But afterwards, she said it wasn't her and she wouldn't kill her husband because she was a good wife and loved him madly. Then tearfully reported that it was the work of gangsters and her former spouse had a lot of envious people. And so they stabbed a man to death without blinking an eye. Yet all those who detained her didn't even do a proper investigation. And then I wondered, how could they push her into jail and completely ignore her information? But at that moment, Ian Connor looked at her in all seriousness and ordered her to stop this spectacle. Because no matter what kind of wife she was, it wouldn't make a difference, because she was guilty as charged. But the protagonist only looked up at him unhappily and wondered if that kind of hysterical behavior didn't work on him. Then she wondered if Ian Connor really thought she could do something like that. But he calmly said that at one time, no one thought that the girl could also escape from the women's prison and from Al Cafe's, so no one knew what to expect from her. Then the girl looked at one of the soldiers, while Ian Connor continued and told her that although she was a weak and frail girl, that didn't mean she didn't have a way to commit this crime, because all the evidence pointed to her, and so she was a criminal and a liar. Then he turned to Henry Revil and asked him to take her to her cell, but the girl struggled to the end and claimed she was innocent. And Henry Revil, clasping her hand tightly to keep her from escaping, said she must hurry. And Rosen Walker only wondered where they were going to take her. But then she realized that compared to her past probation officers, these young men were really gentlemen. And usually now they would have swung their military shoes at her, because in any case, a criminal and a probation officer, it's like a battle between a mouse and a cat. So if she just relaxes once, she'll be grabbed, and then it's definitely over. But finding escape routes was her specialty. Then looking at Ian Connor, she thought that this time she would win the fight too, and noticed the keys hanging from his belt. Eventually, when Henry Revil, Ian Connor, and Rosen Walker were in the main hall, and the commander asked when the party was over. But Henry Revil only awkwardly explained that they were in the process of transferring the Al Cafe's witch to a cell, and they couldn't get her through the noble ladies and gentlemen. But Connor calmly reported that even so, noble ladies and gentlemen are now on this liner, and only to go on a tour of the prison. So it seemed to him that to see the witch of Al Cafe's would be even more interesting. Hearing this, Henry Revil only reported that Ian Connor had thought in a similar spirit because he was a unique man. But other people were not as brave. Rosen Walker then reflected on the fact that much has changed since the war. And originally intended as a military supply steamer, it was converted to a passenger ship after the war ended, like so many others. And the liner on which they were now standing awaited the same fate. And the steamer, which once was full of wounded soldiers, gunpowder smoke. And the sound of gunshots had in a moment turned the Oka into a place of lavish parties accompanied by joyous music. And now this rebuilt ship was on course for the island with the most dangerous prison. And the prisoners that were transported to this island knew very well that this place was considered so perilous that it was considered an achievement for a criminal to keep alive there. And tourists so eager to see this place that they even sailed on the same steamer with her is something so ludicrous that it was not often seen. But at this point, Henry Revil went on and said that in addition, something as bad-smelling as the main character would make everyone nauseous and would only raise a ruckus, and added that even during the war, a corpse had a better odor. But Counter calmly informed Henry Revil that they had not looked much better themselves during the war, but he literally screamed and said that as for Rosenwalker, it was a very different case. While they were shaking with fear just to save one more life, the girl had killed her own husband. And not only had she not shown favor for not being executed immediately, she had escaped twice. So he thought it was a waste of manpower and tax dollars for her to live in prison. The indignant protagonist only shouted at him and wondered why he was being so noisy. But at that moment, the commander turned to him and looked seriously at Henry Revil and told him that he should keep his temper in check and that he had no reason to waste his nerves. Henry Revil, only frightened, apologized, glaring at his captain, but then informed him that the commander really didn't need to let his guard down around Rosina because the woman could be a real witch. Eventually, they came on deck, and the commander, passing on, told Rosina and Henry Revil to follow them. And at this time, the girl was looking at the insanely bright, beautiful moon that rose above the sea like a mesmerized woman, and wondered if she had to be a world-famous criminal to see something like this. And she never thought she'd see something so beautiful in her whole life. But at that moment, she was approached by Connor, who asked if it was true that the girl had previously claimed to have escaped from Al-Khafiz, only because she had mated with a spoon. But she only wondered why such a thing was being asked about. And then Connor looked at her calmly and told her that people were now saying that the girl had actually used magic during her escape and wondered if it was true, and then said that the last successful escape from Al-Khafiz was made by a witch 36 years ago. So when the press first heard about Rosina's escape, people were convinced that she was a witch too. Then the girl thought that people were inherently afraid of things they couldn't understand. And this was an age when science was elevated above magic and worse. People were banished for using magic. But despite this, traces of the long past still existed and the few remaining witches that simply hide in the most remote corners of the world. But they were not extinct. But then Rosenwalker calmly looked him over and said that if she really was a witch, she would definitely not be in this position and they would never have captured her. And no one would be able to put her in chains. She asked the commander if he thought the very presence of one of the witches on the ship was absurd enough. But Henry Revil looked at the girl with disbelief and told the commander that he should not trust her because not a word of truth came out of her mouth, because she was a skilled liar, and told the commander that all this information was in her file. And during the first hearing, she continuously lied, left pretending to be a victim, and almost deceived the entire empire with her behavior. If she were a witch, she would have sewed his mouth shut from the start, but he only tried to say something indignantly. But Rosalie interrupted him and said that she had even undergone a procedure to detect magical power, and wondered what other proof he needed. Then asked, is the military of this country so stupid that even so simple a fact cannot understand? Henry Revil was madly angry and grabbed the girl. But the commander looked him over carefully and told him that he must keep his hands off the prisoner. And if he let his feelings get the better of him again and continued his rampage, he would report it to his superiors. Then he addressed Rosina as the empire's most famous fugitive and witch of Al-Khafiz, and said that he didn't care whether she was lying to him or telling the truth, or whether she was a witch or not, because he just wanted to remind her of some fairly obvious things. And the first was that she's a convict who got her sentence, and she was sentenced to life in prison on the island. The second was that he was ordered to take her to the island. And the third was that she wasn't the first to escape from Al-Khafiz, but he'd never managed to escape from the island before. Then, carefully looking at her slightly surprised face, calmly explained that it was impossible even for a witch to get out of this island. And then Rosenwalker noticed that although politely, but the commander really morally pressured her, after which she began to scrutinize him and realized that the young man definitely had to have the keys with him, either to the lifeboat or to the handcuffs. And if she really wanted to escape, she really needed to do so before arriving on the island. But the next moment she was distracted by Henry Revil, who informed the man that he had brought what he had asked for. And as a result, a tray of bloody meat appeared in front of the protagonist. And then she began to look at the commander in surprise, waiting for what he would do. And he calmly tilted the tray so that the meat slipped into the water, said that the girl should look as closely as possible on what sea they were now sailing. And when pieces of meat fell into the sea, Rosina was horrified to see that it immediately began to be torn apart by the monsters that lived in the sea. And looking at her madly surprised and shocked face, Henry Revil said with a smile that she should have taken a good look at it, because this sea was full of such monsters and Elementary had nowhere to run. And then Connor took out the keys that had been hanging from his belt and told a girl that if she wanted to be a snack for monsters, he would advise her to get on a lifeboat and go to the new adventure, because apparently she wanted those keys badly enough. At that moment, a worried Rosenwalker looked over at Connor and realized that he was no gentleman and realized that she'd been mistaken, for the warden could not be a gentleman with a criminal. But at that moment, he confirmed her conjecture with a sly smile and said that he hoped Rosen had changed her mind about her escape. Then she realized, looking at Connor in front of her, that it was the same man, but he was nothing like the man from the flyers, and she had no idea how he interacted with normal people. But with her, it was completely different, because in a way, she was just a rat compared to him. Eventually, after a little more time, the protagonist found herself in her prison cell and began to think about her ways to escape and did not know what to do. But at that moment, she was approached by a woman who asked if Rosenwalker really didn't want to tell what had happened. After all, she and Connor had a private conversation, but she calmly said that they did have a conversation, but he only said to forget about her escape. And then the flustered woman wondered if he had really said such a trivial thing to her and nothing else. And then Rosenwalker only wondered what exactly the woman wanted her to say. But Maria only smiled slyly and said that the fact that a young and pretty prisoner had gone to the room of a young and terribly attractive commander did indeed raise a lot of questions. Then she confessed that she could not restrain her fantasy and asked Rosany to tell her everything in detail. She only asked unhappily where the woman saw the pretty and young girl in front of her now, because she looked completely different. But Maria calmly explained that she was the youngest of them all anyway, and asked if it was true that nothing had happened between her and the commander. Then the protagonist grudgingly asked how Connor could do something like that to a ragamuffin like her. But Maria calmly said that in that case, she should have just jumped him like she'd done earlier at Alcafisa. But the girl sadly reported that the problem was not only Connor, because this sea was completely filled with monsters, and she absolutely did not know what to do about it. But at that moment, Maria was excited, looking at her, asked if the girl was going to surrender. It was Maria from Al Cafes, an inmate whose nickname of Al Cafes Witch suited her better than her. If the wardens ruled outside the prison cells, it was Mary who had all the power inside. And if she didn't like someone, that person simply didn't live to see the end of their sentence. And when the girl got to Al Cafeza, she'd already been famous for one successful escape, and she didn't know if it was because of her fame or not. But because Maria liked her, the inmates who were in charge of her got on well with her, and her prison life became much more peaceful. And at this moment, the protagonist is excited. Looking at all the criminals that were in the same cell with her, finally realized that they wanted her victory, and they all wanted the protagonist to trample the pride of the Imperial Army on display and erase any traces, and at the same time live a quiet life somewhere else. So scrutinizing them, she informed Maria that she must have known perfectly well that the girl would not give up for anything. And at that moment, Rosenwalker realized with a smile that she couldn't do that, since she was the example for all these people. Maria only smiled and said that it was a really good decision, then threw her a cigarette and offered her a smoke. And the protagonist, in shock, did not understand where Maria had managed to get them. In the end, the girl sat back and relaxed and let out a smoke. Then she asked if Connor had been a pilot from the beginning, because he must have had a lot of merits in the war, and for such a man, even an important post in the government was nothing but a reward. So she wondered what he'd forgotten. In a place like this, it's not even a job fit for an air warrior. But Maria calmly said that she had absolutely no idea why. But perhaps he had been crippled in some way and was demoted. But Rosenwalker calmly explained that he looked fine. And then Maria calmly explained that you don't have to lose limbs to be a colleague. And then pointing to his head, she made Rosina realize that he might have just lost his mind. But the protagonist was not happy looking at her and asked her not to say anything stupid. But the woman calmly said that in fact she did not care whether it was true or not because it made absolutely no difference to them. Then she looked at Rosaline carefully and said that the most important thing for them was to find a way to get this man to get out of here. But Rosenwalker calmly said that such methods only work on the brainless, and frankly she didn't know what was best to do now. For even if she had managed to steal the key, she would not have been able to cross such a dangerous sea, especially on a lifeboat without a motor, and then realized that the problem wasn't just the monsters. It was that if she didn't get killed, she'd die of exhaustion anyway. However, she didn't feel like she got any other way. But then she was displeased to hear a noise, and looking out of the grate she noticed a little girl playing with a ball, and she didn't understand what the child was doing here. So she excitedly asked Maria what the girl was doing here, but she calmly said she had absolutely no idea what the child was doing here. But the same girl had brought her cigarettes and matches. But a disgruntled Rosenwalker said it was wrong to use children so shamelessly. Then turned to the little girl and warned her that she shouldn't go alone in a place like this, and asked where her parents were. But she immediately started to run closer to her, and the protagonist said that she shouldn't have come back at all, but on the contrary, she had to leave. But the child ran up to say hello to her and introduced herself. Her name was Leila Revil. Upon hearing her last name, the protagonist only asked if she knew Henry Revil. But the girl said with a smile that Henry Revil was her uncle, and asked if the girl knew him. She only awkwardly said they knew each other. Then remembering this guy thought he was a real jerk, and she didn't understand what he was doing instead of watching the kid. But then she looked at the girl carefully and wondered, didn't she know she wasn't allowed to go to places like this? It wasn't a playground. But then she thought that the girl was lucky that she was not like her uncle. But at that moment, Leila Revil calmly announced that she had already boasted to her friends that she would meet Rosenwalker here, who was the most famous fugitive of the Empire, as well as the Witch of Al-Kafas, and said that people talked about her when they boarded their ship, and her grandfather was the ship's captain. So she told her friends she could meet this girl, but no one believed her. Well then, the protagonist, looking her over with a smile, said that Leila Revil had come to the right place, because she was Rosina. At this time, her uncle was on deck with the captain, and began to reflect unhappily that it was a headache all around, and only trouble because of this fugitive. But Connor calmly said that Henry Revil should treat it as if they were going on vacation, and the island was just a turning point. After that, they'd have a return course, and said that the views in that place were really good, so good that people who were there were willing to pay for a tour. But Henry Revil only calmly said that the remote wilderness should also be remote only in moderation, and grudgingly remarked that the war was barely over and people were already bored, and so they had gone to the island prison across the monster-infested sea, and thought it a maddeningly strange amusement. But hearing such senile comments from his friend, Connor only said that the end of the war had made Henry Revil a young old man. But he calmly remarked that if sanity counted as old age, then he would indeed prefer to be so. But after hearing that about this woman, I mean the main character, you have to be really careful. Then said she was from Raritan, and admitted that if Rosenwalker was from Raritan, then it looks like she lived on the outskirts of town and committed the crime. But Connor calmly said that he already knew about it, to which Henry Revil calmly replied that of course he must have known about it because he had written it in the report. And he had told him about it because it seemed to him that Ian Connor had focused on this particular criminal because of where she was from, and had even spoken to her personally. At that time, the boy remembered that Raritan was his little homeland, and their military school was located there, and their youth was spent there. And also there was a bombing raid during the war that turned the whole city into ruins. Henry then said that in a way, the Witch of Al-Kafas was so lucky that it was annoying that the escape had allowed her to get out of town and escape death. But Connor calmly said that even so, Rosina still had a life sentence on her, and it was because of that that her life had been saved. Whereupon Henry Revil, holding himself up with shaking hands, stated that the girl had become famous and was now on her way to the island prison under the supervision of Sir Ian Connor himself. But Connor reported with a smile that everything was correct, and he knew exactly what going to this island meant. And Henry Revil just remembering his past is not even that. Despite what he knew, at least the girl didn't die and managed to survive, because a lot of people haven't even been able to do that. At this point, the protagonist was still talking to Leila, who looked at her admiringly and wondered if this girl was really Rosina, and she only said with a smile that it was true, but asked her to be quiet because she didn't tell everyone. At that moment, Leila Revil nodded and wondered if it was really true that the girl had broken out of prison by digging with a spoon, and she happily confirmed the words. But the next moment, Leila Revil wondered if it was true that Rosenwalker could possess magic. And at that moment, the protagonist informed that she had a small question, and if the girl would mark, she would show her magic in return. But at that moment, looking at the smiling face of the protagonist, Leila informed that earlier her grandfather said that she should not fulfill the requests of the prisoners. But she only smiled inquiringly. Did the girl really not want to see magic? And promised that she wouldn't ask nothing strange, and she was really curious about something. And then the protagonist asked if Leila Revil knew a man like Ian Connor, but she calmly said he was her uncle's boss, a war hero, and also the best pilot. Then the protagonist asked how close he was to her, but she calmly said that they were not close at all, because Connor was a rather cold man. But then she started to remember her uncle saying that Ian Connor didn't show it, but he cared for her a lot. He'd known her since she was still in her mom's belly. And Henry Revil also said that the girl might think of Ian Connor as another uncle, but she wasn't too sure about that. At that moment, taking advantage of Leila's trust, Rosanna tried to find out if the young man was married and if he had a lover or fiancé. But she calmly informed him that he was not married, nor did he have a fiancé, and the other adults are frantically fussing to get married as soon as possible. But Connor doesn't seem to be thinking about it at all. After that, the protagonist wanted to ask Leila if she had seen Ian Connor sleeping with other girls in his room, but realized that she absolutely could not ask about it, as the girl was too young and would not understand this question. So she asked if Leila Revil had not seen Ian Connor's room to enter a girl or that he stayed with some girl alone. And after the protagonist received negative answers, she wondered if it was really expected. But she didn't even expect things to be so bad in his personal life. Then she asked Leila if Ian Connor was really a compassionate person, but the girl only wondered what compassion meant. And at that moment, Maria came to the rescue and explained to Leila that this is what it is called when she feels sorry for someone, or for example, when she walks to her house and sees a puppy drenched in rain, or when a girl would start crying if she saw someone else crying. And that was exactly the feeling. And at that moment, the girl glowed. She wondered. Seeing Leila's face so happy while she was talking about love, the protagonist was sweating, feeling somewhat stressed. And when Maria saw this, she'd only laughed, wondering if the witch of Al-Kafis was getting a cold sweat from something like that, and started making fun of her. And at this point, Leila Revil explained that she didn't really think her uncle could love anyone that easily. But even so, she thought Ian Connor was crazy good because he was a hero. The protagonist, she only smiled as she thanked the child and thought that she was actually still insanely innocent. For someone like her, it made absolutely no difference that Ian Connor was a hero. But afterwards, she announced that now was her part of the bargain and offered to show her real magic and asked the girl to give her something, and it needed to be something small. And then when Leila gave her a coin, she did the trick, and the coin disappeared from her hand. And then Rosenwalker said with a smile that perhaps Leila didn't know, but magic always needed an intermediary. And the girl began to stare admiringly at her empty hand, literally unable to believe that the coin had disappeared so easily. But at this moment, the girl easily took out this coin from behind the child's ear and held out this coin back to Leila, and informed that now this coin was lucky and at sunset it would become gold. However, in return, Leila was not to tell anyone about it, or the magic would dissipate. In the end, after the girl had left, she was approached by Maria, who looked at her carefully and wondered if she had really used magic. But Rosenwalker calmly explained that it was a simple trick, and the girl would soon learn about it too. At this point, Mary asked if she was the one who constantly claimed that I couldn't lie. Then she said that if she were a real witch, she would never allow herself to be arrested so easily. Then, looking carefully at her, he said that if her escape succeeded, what would she do? Because on all four sides of the world, once she was in the open sea, there would be water, and she would have absolutely no place to go. Then looking at her face, he said that she would not get to the mainland on a rescue boat. But in this world, Rosenwalker reported that she had another place, and no one knew for sure if this place really existed. And it is widely said that there is a place on the planet where witches hid from the world. The place was the island of the witch Walpurgis, after which the protagonist stated that a rumor had spread widely among the people that this island was not so far from the prison island, but not everyone was destined to get there. Then she noticed that this island is not simply called the Island of Witches, as it is the last refuge of witches, so they are unlikely to rush to her with greetings shouting welcome. But at that moment, Maria turned to her and looked at her earnestly and said that children were much easier to deceive if they pretended to be pathetic, so it would be a good idea to try it on the commander, and asked what Rosenwalker thought about it. But she just calmly stated that it's probably the only way to go. And so using a hero and getting him a compassion ticket sounds very doable. Because subtle methods that still work on all sorts of assholes with Connor definitely W1 to work. Especially since Ian Connor was a military pilot and a hero, and therefore was the complete opposite of Rosina. Because this man's life was a continuous and uninterrupted victory, and she was sure that she could reach such a high bar, can become someone infinitely pathetic and trampled on so much that he can lie down and shed tears and hand the victory over himself to his opponent. Because the feeling of superiority over someone is much more pleasant. And that feeling is much more addictive than love. And that feeling was also much easier to achieve than that love. At which time, Ian Connor reflected that Henry Revil was bound to do well in the future. But periodically, something like this would still weigh on him. Then he remembered his dialogue with the girl who had warned him that there might come a moment when his feelings would burst out, and they would be feelings that he had for someone inexplicably specific. And sometimes these feelings would be impossible to contain. Ian Connor asked what he should do in such situations, but the girl calmly informed him that at such times he should not interrupt Henry Revil, nor stop him, but simply keep silent and listen and let him verbally express what was in his soul. And her last piece of advice was to give pertinent answers until this was all over. Whereupon Connor looked carefully at Henry Revil that they had been outside too long and suggested they come inside. Finally, once they were inside, Henry Revil was outraged. He hadn't thought about it, but he still thought it was outrageous. After all, they ordered the transport of the Witch of Al-Kafis to a war hero, and he was speechless. But Connor calmly said that there was nothing to be done about it. It was the military's job to follow orders. But Henry Revil only grudgingly wondered if Ian Connor would be nominated for an important post once the job was done. After all, accumulated exploits are no joke, and he should have been given credit as well, because it was necessary, because the only people in the Empire who hated him were the bastards in the army, and they came from Roran. And it was because of men like them that men had to go through all this torment now. He said that all these people were trying to make him responsible for failing to protect Roran, so they demanded that he at least demonstrate that he was punishing the witch. Then Henry said that if Connor took that girl, the only shameful escape from the city, and showed everyone how he dumped her on the island, all those people would turn a blind eye to the loss and start supporting him again. After which he said that Ian Connor was given that order for that reason only. And it was all just a show, and so everyone wanted Ian Connor to be the perfect hero with no blemishes and no flaws, and then bent down and asked Ian Connor to make sure that, despite all this, as soon as they were done with this kind of work, the men were to rest a little and live for themselves, for there was only a brilliant road ahead of them. Then the young man thought about the words Henry Revil had said, for it was only after the war was over, passing through the triumphal arch of his uniform, that he realized this fact. And at that moment, a huge crowd of people were chanting just one name, and people were carrying baskets of flowers and scattering colorful petals. However, remembering himself standing in front of this picture, the man did not realize whether he felt joy and emotion, and he did not even know with what expression he passed through the triumphal arch. Although he should have smiled, but he did not believe that his smile was convincing. So he remembered absolutely nothing. But at that moment, the voice of Henry Revil rang out and said that it was impossible to protect everyone. And there is no such thing as absolute victory. For Ian Connor was not a god, and everyone knew that a commander must always fulfill his duty and choose the lesser of two evils. But Ian Connor convinced him that he didn't have to do that, and he could deal with it himself, and that he should ignore it and concentrate on the recovery. But to this, the boy only calmly informed that he had not been a patient for a long time, but then thought that perhaps he really should do some work on his health. As a result, Connor sat in his office and sorted through the papers and remembered the words of Henry Revil, and could not believe it really was not his fault, because at that moment, all the approved strategies of the Air Force was a sick gambling game. And in Henry's opinion, if not for the commander, everything would have come to a crashing halt. But he couldn't figure out who was responsible, and for all those ruined lives. He then remembered his conversation with the commander when the man had informed him that Ian Connor was going to transport prisoners to the island prison, and he should keep a particularly close eye on Rosina. Then, looking at her picture, he literally couldn't believe that she was the runaway from Ryorton and also the sole survivor, and was now completely healthy and alive. But at that moment, there was a voice displeased with the protagonist, who looked at him and wondered why he called her, if all this time he did not listen to her at all. Then the man calmly reported that he had indeed listened to her, and said that they should go on and on about the sharks, and also their diet because the girl should have known about it. But at this point, the protagonist only grudgingly went to the desk and snatched up all his papers and threw them in the air so that they swirled around them. And she grudgingly announced that she had already realized what Connor was trying to tell her, and summarized that thinking about running away was a really stupid thing to do. But she grudgingly admitted that even with lectures on sea monsters, one had to be moderate. And she wondered how many days this had been going on, and grudgingly wondered, did the man really think she was an idiot? But he only calmly informed her, looking into her angry face, that the only thing that distinguished an idiot from a hero was a piece of paper. And heroes and idiots do not think of the consequences. But if the protagonist starts thinking with her head, she might not dare to do something like that. But she only looked at him with a smile, asked did he mean to say that she wasn't using her head right now. But he only calmly said that Rosen Walker was acting brave enough, and some people probably held her up as a dark hero. But the protagonist said that she was not asking about that at all, and asked the young man, looking directly at her, whether she was an idiot or a heroine. But he calmly said that according to his criteria, she was clearly an idiot who decided to make an escape. Then asked her to behave more calmly because of his unsatisfactory answer by his standards, started to destroy his office. And then calmly, a girl asked with a smile if Connor thought she should have done 50 years in prison. She admitted that from her point of view, it was much more foolish. And she asked what he thought she should have done. Whereupon she conceived that if she summarized everything she'd learned from private conversations over the past few days, it was that Connor was showing the most interest when she was talking nonsense. She looked at him carefully and asked him to tell her about his thoughts, and thought about the fact that apparently when she cried and pretended to be a victim, it didn't work on this man at all. But other methods really worked much better. Connor exhaled unhappily and continued to make notes on the paper, and said that it should have started with the fact that at the initial sentencing, if the girl had honestly confessed her guilt, she would have received a commutation. And in prison, if she had behaved in good faith, she could have applied for parole, or for a transfer to a prison with better conditions. But she just smiled and said that if that was the case, she would have died for sure. But afterwards, she said that she should have started with the fact that she didn't understand why she had to rot in prison for 50 years. But he calmly informed that she was imprisoned for murder, and that it was a typical practice that the sentence for this crime ranged from 8 to 50 years, and it was written in the law. Rosen was only dissatisfied that she could allow such a thing to happen, even though she had not killed anyone. But she wondered why she was given 50 years. After all, a man who had lived in the neighborhood for a long time had beaten his wife to death and was sentenced to only 8 years. But he calmly pointed to the rack of books behind the protagonist and said that the reason for this should also be spelled out in the law. But the protagonist looked at the books and said that she couldn't read. Connor said that he understood that, but he had just explained it all. And the answer she should have known was that the reasons for such a long confinement were spelled out in the law. Then rising from his seat and looking her over with a stern look, informed her that in spite of this, the blame for the fact that the girl was now sentenced to life imprisonment on the island prison was hers alone. After all, she had done it herself. All for it. After that, he informed the girl that he was too long indulgent to her and said that their personal conversation was over. But the protagonist realized that she just can't leave like that now. After all, if she leaves now with nothing after, everything will just repeat. And in the worst case, his another chance may not be. So she had to say something so delusional that it would catch Connor off guard. So she awkwardly informed him that Connor was actually just as much of an idiot as she was, but he only grudgingly asked what she meant. And then she said emphatically that she had said earlier that heroes and idiots were separated only by a piece of paper. And in that case, they were the same, because he was the sunshine hero, and she was the darkness hero, and they were both idiots. Then, looking carefully at his displeased face, she asked him why they were different and said that previously no one believed that they could win the war. After all, they were just a small country distinguished only by the pompous correspondence of the empire, while the attacking country had already invaded several other states. But the man just clenched his fist and said that they were able to win after all, and Rosenwalker confirmed his words by saying that in fact it was a completely empty victory, because they got nothing out of it. Only broken people in cities that lay in ruins, and Ian Connor, called a hero, had just been dressed up in a nice uniform and was now transporting pathetic prisoners. She wondered why their incomparable war heroes were now doing such a job. But at that moment, roughly pulling her hook closer, Ian Connor ordered her to close her mouth. And at that moment, the protagonist realized that this man had finally fallen into his trap and fell for her provocation. So with a smile, I wondered if he called such a thing a victory and expected that now he should hit him. So she said that the victory could not be so grandiose if there was nothing to be proud of. And she kept thinking that it wasn't a problem to endure a momentary pain. And so Ian Connor had to give her a good squeeze on the floor with his military boot, and it was all right, because she was absolutely used to it. But to her great shock, Connor did not, and angrily kicked the wooden door and informed Rosina that her words were indeed true, but she had no right to say them, since countless of his comrades had been killed and wounded in the skies of their homeland. And history will not remember them and never has, but they even knowing this sacrificed their young lives to protect the citizens of the Empire. After which Ian Connor grudgingly said that he did not think that people like the protagonist, who could only run away, must feel reverent gratitude to them for this. But at least she didn't have to insult them. Then he said that he hoped that Rosenwalker had realized that not everyone lived like her, and stated that the girl was probably trying to provoke him to get his attention. But he ordered her to stop trying such obvious tricks for her provocation, and her lies were too limited to be deceived. And if she really wanted compassion, she had better look for another man. The protagonist, looking at him in amazement, thought that apparently this man was the type of person who could only be angry, but resolutely said that she had not lied to him at all. And Connor only smiled. He said that the girl did not surprise him at all. Then he said with a smile that in fact there was no need for such chains in the sea, but the girl was still shackled in them as a symbol of the gravity of her crime, and for her sin of taking the life of another human being. And at that moment, Rosenwalker thought about the fact that even though the words had come out of Connor's mouth, there were two completely opposite voices overlapping in her head. And she immediately began to remember the moment when everyone was listening to Ian Connor cheerfully congratulate the citizens on the end of the war. So all she could say was that Ian Connor really is an idiot. But he just looked at her calmly and said that he understood what the girl was really like. He told her that they would have no more private conversations and ordered her to go back to her prison. And the main character, that she found herself at the door reflecting on the fact that she'd been stupid and expected something different from Connor. Ian Connor told the citizens of the Empire that they no longer had to worry because they were no longer being hurt. And if the air raid alarm sounded, they had to put out the fire and go underground, and listen to the radio announcements, and promised that he would protect the Empire's skies from his post. And then Rosenwalker realized that she had obviously overheard that voice if she was expecting to hear it again. And she realized that without realizing it, she was constantly forgetting reality and falling into a world of self-deception. And an example of such self-deception was that she thought that if she continued to talk to Ian Connor, she would someday hear his warm voice again. And she had a strange delusion about that, after which the girl began to reflect on the fact that she was madly mad about Ian Connor's relationships. Because apparently when he became a hero, she thought that he had achieved everything and promised herself that she would not let herself break in a place like this, because she would have her chance. But at that moment, Revil came up to her and inquired what she was doing here, for the girl had even gathered up her hair and wiped her face, and had she had anything red, she would probably have put on even lipstick. But the protagonist only smiled and said that it was really worth to look at her clean, because she was really insanely beautiful. But Revil only said that it was really even funny and asked what trick the girl was going to use this time. But she calmly went to her prison cell and said that she had just been saving drinking water, which, by the way, was hardly enough. And so she washed her face, as a human being should. But Revil only grudgingly asked her not to deceive. For whatever tricks the girl decided to use, it would certainly not work on him. Then the girl looked at him carefully and asked him what tricks he thought she had used. But he calmly said that he didn't know at all, but that she had used all kinds of tricks. At that moment, Rosenwalker realized that if Ian Connor had been even a quarter as simple as Revil, she would have succeeded. Whereupon the protagonist smiled and said that he should not pretend that he knew nothing, for that was to be expected when a man and a woman were alone together. But at that moment, an agitated Henry Revil ordered her to be silent. But the protagonist only smilingly wondered if Henry Revil was interested in her, and then said that if you judge because he's always talking some nonsense about some tricks, it seems as if she's right. An awkward Henry Revil, only taking the girl further down the corridors, wiped his forehead and face red with embarrassment, and informed her that he simply wouldn't be socializing with Rosina anymore. But she only offered with a smile that they should be friends. But after she noticed a little girl, Leila, and looking at the child thought that the girl again fearless everywhere goes, and that the child absolutely cannot be left alone like that. But after shifting her gaze to Henry, she began to reflect on the fact that when she saw them side by side, now I really did seem to think they were alike in some way. After which she leaned over to Henry Revil with an insanely frightening smile and informed him that his niece was indeed insanely cute, and inquired about her name. After which she remembered that her name was Leila Revil. And then Henry looked madly frightened at the look on her face and literally shuddered and wondered how the protagonist knew about such a thing. Then he excitedly rushed to his niece and dropped her keys, then asked what the protagonist did. But she only smilingly said that she could not do anything, as she was in handcuffs, and asked why he was so much scared. And then the girl picked up the keys discreetly while Henry Revil continued to scold her, and said that the girl was sure to be discovered soon, and threatened that she must not lay a finger on her niece. But the moment they looked at her, they saw that the girl was in tears, and then the shocked protagonist immediately realized that apparently the child had something stuck in her throat, and immediately told Henry Revil that he needed to call a doctor. But she saw that he was frozen with shock and didn't react, and she started screaming, wondering if there was a doctor on the ship. A small child was dying. But Henry Revil was shocked and looking at him. Rosina just couldn't move, and she didn't understand what was going on with this guy. And she realized it was useless, and as luck would have it, they were now in the uninhabited part of the ship. But after she got excited, looking at a frantically frightened Henry Revil, showed him her handcuffs and informed him that she knew what to do. So she ordered him to release her now. And in that moment, all the memories of learning first aid and CPR with her teacher before all the horrible events in her life immediately flashed before her eyes. At this point, a startled Henry resolutely immediately removed the handcuffs from her hands. And the girl reflects on the words of her teacher, who told her that man is an insanely fragile creature who can get hurt and die for the most absolute reasons. That's why she was trained in first aid to know how to save in this case. And then her teacher said that one person will not be able to save the whole world. Not everyone is given to possess magic, but any person may need some magic at some point in his life. As a result, the next moment, a bright light shone in the girl's hands, and she, running up to Leila, used magic power, and at this noise in the course of time, the aristocrats began to come together, excitedly worried about what that noise was. And then they learned that it was a little girl in trouble, but she was saved by the girl who was now near her. And the main character was hugging a crying Leila and just thinking about the fact that she had actually made it and was able to save this little baby, and was insanely happy that she was finally able to do something useful. As a result, the next moment, a crying and madly frightened Henry Revil came running up to them, and seizing Leila asked if she was all right, and if she was all right. And the excited aristocrats were still chatting about what had happened. And then one of the aristocrats said that she didn't see the whole picture, but when she came out, she saw the girl grab the baby and give her first aid. And I think she had something stuck in her throat. But at that moment, the protagonist only looked at what was lying near her hand and saw that it was a candy. Then she got excited and laughed nervously. And she realized that not only a bullet could kill a person, but even an ordinary candy, and in such a case, not only the military was able to save or kill. After which she thought sadly that her teacher had indeed been right, and she began to reflect on the fact that Henry Revil had finally taken himself in. Then she saw the young man who had approached her, but could not yet see his face, and inquired whether Henry Revil found her skill sufficiently useful in such situations. Then she said that if Henry Revil was grateful to her, he would ask her to give her some water to wash herself, or he could leave some parcels in her cell. But then she wondered why he didn't say anything. It was just the price of living. At that moment, she saw someone she didn't expect. Connor was handcuffed in front of her, and she looked at him carefully and wondered what he was doing here. After that, there was another man's cry addressed to the little girl. And then the protagonist looked at this picture and realized that now the little child was embraced by her grandfather. And the protagonist literally glowed with happiness that she was able to save her little life. And rising from her seat, she said that it didn't matter. She just said the water thing, and she hadn't helped Leila because she wanted some kind of reward. But Connor calmly informed him that such a reward was nothing but a pittance, especially since the Empire always pays for a life preserved, even if she was a criminal to be imprisoned on the island, and calmly handed her the handcuffs and told her that he didn't care at all. She thanked him with a smile and wondered if the guy would really let her wash. But afterwards, he, confirming her words, said that even so her hands would have to be restrained. And Walker only inquired how she should wash with her hands restrained, and whether she should only have to douse herself with water like some vegetable. But at that moment, the captain of the ship turned to her and said that in that case, it would be possible to introduce the people who would serve her, and she would be a princess, though it was not to be in her destiny. Then he looked at Connor and called him an unmannerly bastard and wondered if he had taught him anything like that, and how he could chain his granddaughter's savior. Then he told Connor that he had previously ordered Henry Revil to escort all the passengers back. But the most important thing now was something else, and demanded that Connor at least let the lady go for a while, because in any case there was a sea around them. But he only grudgingly said that such a thing could not be done. And at that moment, the captain of the ship shouted angrily and inquired, why couldn't something like this be done? And informed her that absolutely anything was possible in this world. And so he had to let her go and let the girl wash. But Connor calmly said that based on the laws of the Empire, they had no right to do so. But the captain of the ship only asked angrily, did the guy think that he would be affected by such words? Because at sea, the laws of the land do not work. And on this liner, he was the law, and then firmly inquired whether Connor lacked even a minimum of flexibility, and inquired how he could behave in such a manner with his granddaughter's savior, and then informed her that at least he should have taken off his chains, at least when he was thanking her. For with what a face he should have thanked her, while the girl stood shackled before him. At this time, Connor looked calmly at the captain of the ship that was scrutinizing his granddaughter and reported that Walker was a criminal. But the man only looked fondly at Leila Revil and said that this girl was a savior to him first and foremost. To which Connor calmly replied that this was not true at all, and Walker was indeed a criminal first and foremost. But it seems the captain couldn't stand it any longer and wondered, did Connor always need to get a few words in edgewise, and started hitting him with his cane. But the Comte just asked the captain to calm down and informed him that he was a military man on an errand from his superiors, so there could be no exceptions. But the men completely ignored these words of Connor, and turning to the protagonist, apologized for this guy's rude behavior and asked him to accept a sincere thank you. Then leaning closer, he said that he had forgotten to introduce himself earlier and said that he was now retired, but he had once been an admiral in the Navy. And though it was embarrassing to say such a thing, it seemed to him that the girl must have heard the name Revil. And then the girl wondered if she'd actually heard a name like that somewhere. And after shock, she wondered if he was Mr. Braun's statue of a war hero on the square of the capital. After which she remembered that it was a famous landmark of their imperial capital. Braun's statue of Alex River leading an attack on the enemies. But the man only smiled, happily reported that we are madly pleased that the girl recognized him. And the protagonist only shocked to think that it was not surprising at all that she heard his name. After all, this man was a hero of the old war, and even children like her, who had never been given a glimpse of the school, had seen a portrait of the hero Alex Revil, and he was indeed an incredibly influential person. Then she thought that she couldn't believe that Henry Revil would be the Revil, because Henry Revil was just a jerk, and his niece was an insanely sweet girl, and Leila's grandfather was a war hero. And then the protagonist coughed and said that her name was actually Walker, and wondered if the ship's captain knew about it. But he only smiled and asked if he could call her Ms. Walker. Then, leaning over to Leila, he told her that this girl was his only granddaughter, and if it weren't for the protagonist, she would have died today. Then he asked if all she really wanted for her rescue was a wash and a meal. But she calmly looked at them and told him that she would be grateful if they would bring water and food to her detention cell, and it would be nice if there was meat there as well. But the man only calmly informed her that this was impossible, because it's impossible for the Revil family to communicate in such a manner with a benefactor, and their centuries of honor simply won't allow such an attitude. So he informed her that if the girl had nothing planned for tomorrow night, he would like her to do the honors and attend the dinner party. But the protagonist, imagining this picture of herself, realized that she absolutely did not fit into the secular society. So she said that she had to give up. because even to imagine such a thing was quite burdensome. But at that moment, the captain of the ship smiled and said that if Rosenwalker thought it would be tedious, she need not worry. After all, she would not be presented to the high society, and it would only be a dinner with his family. And then looking into his smiling face, the protagonist thought that this man was stranger than all the others. But at that moment, Connor spoke to the captain of the ship, who said that such rewards would be too rich for the girl. After all, this girl was not what she seemed from the beginning. And then Rosenwalker thought about the fact that the guy was going to call her a murderer, a witch, a ragamuffin. And so this type of treatment was not appropriate for her, because she was disgusting and dangerous. And as it turned out, the man did report that the girl was a murderer, but she interrupted him and smilingly told the captain that it would be indeed a great honor for her, and she could not refuse such an offer, for she'd been hungry all the time since recently. Then she said that she could also eat even if her hands were shackled. But Connor at once informed the captain that he could not ignore the fact that the girl might escape. But she calmly informed him that she would not escape in any case, for Sir Connor had kindly shown her the terrible creatures that dwelt in the sea. And at that moment, a memory immediately crept into her mind of her teacher, who looked at her with a displeased look and wondered if Rosenwalker had decided to take those flyers again. But she just embarrassingly hides them, saying she was just passing by and happened to find them. But her teacher only informed her that the girl was indeed addicted to them, after which she asked her to be careful that Hindley didn't see her. And then the protagonist awkwardly admitted to herself that although she didn't want to, she expected a lot from Connor. And each time she became gradually convinced that the man was not at all what she had imagined him to be. And she became so angry that she could stand it no longer. After all, Connor was supposed to be just a man who would remain in her fantasies. And she was supposed to remain just an imperial townswoman who was fascinated by a man like Connor. But life always takes her in other completely unexpected directions. So the girl looked up into Connor's face with a smile on her face and wondered if he still thought she would run away, even after all she had seen at sea. In the end, the protagonist woke up in a luxurious room on beds and still couldn't understand where she was. But afterwards, she realized that it was definitely not a prison cell. So she decided that she should at least get some more sleep. But at that moment, 3 maids came into the room and greeted her and asked if she had slept well last night. It was Michaela, Louis, and May, and they apologized for the mistress waking up so early. But they needed to help her wash before the water got cold, after which the girl was approached with both arms around her on both sides, and informed her that she had to get up, for they had prepared a bath just before coming to them. And it was best to bathe before the water got cold. And the protagonist excitedly asked them to stop while they undressed her. But in the end, the girl really enjoyed herself, and she realized that there really was no other paradise for her. And then in the bathroom, she finally remembered how she'd gotten here, because the captain had invited her to dinner to thank her. And she said yes, because she didn't like Connor's reaction, and she just wanted to get back in a little bit. And then she was sent to the princess room. And then the protagonist, still lying in the bathtub, thought about something. She had no idea how long it had been since she had taken a bath, and thought about the fact that apparently the maids who were with her had been sent away by the captain. At that moment, she was approached by Michaela, who asked Rosina if she was really a witch. But afterwards, she apologized embarrassedly for such a question and said that it had to do with the fact that earlier little Leila had been very proud of having met a witch, and she had begged hard to keep it a secret. On the main character, only smiling reported that children often take such things as a given, and maids only laughed reported that children truth is insanely naive. After which the excited maids approached her and suggested that she add a little more warm water. The girl waved her hands and assured them that it was all right. But the maid was adamant and explained that she would add just a little more. After all, it would help her relax. After all, the captain had specifically instructed them. And then the protagonist thought about the fact that the more she stayed in the warm water, the more piercing the cold wind would seem. And she didn't want to get used to that warmth, because for her something like that was nothing more than a luxury. But she hadn't known any better in the past. But now it was different. And she didn't want to run around and fall in someone's warm arms like a fool. So she promised herself that it wouldn't happen again. But at that moment, the protagonist heard shouting outside the bathroom door. And it turned out to be Henry Revil, who indignantly informed the maids that he must go inside. And even if he did not want to, it was all for observation. But the maids informed Sir that it was enough that they were already here. But he asked indignantly, couldn't he just stand in front of the bathroom door? After all, that was an order. Well, at this point, the protagonist came out, covered only by a single towel, looked at Henry Revil and wondered if he had anything to say to her. And at this point, the maddeningly displaced Henry Revil, covering his face, wondered if the protagonist was completely unaware and that he was still a man. Then turned to the maids and informed them that they all needed to go out for a minute. They were madly surprised and absolutely did not understand how he could ask for such a thing. But he informed them that he really only needed a minute, and there was confidential information that he needed to pass on. But the excited maids began to scold him and said that he couldn't do it now, and he had to do it at least after Miss Walker had put on her clothes. But he said that he wouldn't allow himself anything personal and only needed to deliver Anne Connor's orders. Eventually, the maids did leave the room, and the disgruntled protagonist looked him over and wondered what had happened, because he appeared out of nowhere and just chased everyone else away. And is he trying to search? But he only grudgingly wondered what was to be found on a naked female body and wondered if he looked like a pervert. But she looked at his disgruntled face and said that given the situation, it looked like he was indeed a pervert. But he indignantly asked her to stay where she was, for he had only a few words to say. Just a few words, at which time the protagonist returned to her bathroom and informed Henry Revil that he really couldn't lie, and he only indignantly inquired what the girl meant. But the protagonist calmly explained that he should have just thought about how it looked from the outside. After all, she was in the bathroom now, and it made absolutely no sense for him to stay here. After he said that the guy had come here because he had something to say, and the message had to be delivered in person. And maybe his boss had ordered a guard at the bathroom door, but she didn't think Anne Connor had ordered him in. So he didn't have to make an excuse if he had something to say to her. Now was the time to do it. And then he admitted that he'd come because he wanted to talk about his niece, Leila. And the protagonist calmly informed him that since the conversation was about that, she wanted to inform him that Henry Revil was just a hopeless uncle. But he only awkwardly informed her that there was really no arguing with that, and he couldn't say anything in his defense. Afterwards, the main character remembered the girl and wondered if she was all right now. But Henry Revil assured her that she was fine, because Leila Revil always had doctors with her at night to look after her. So the girl was fine now. But in the end, the protagonist, remembering the frightened face of the young man in that situation, thought that there must have been another side to the coin. And there was a man who was not doing so well. So she asked if Henry Revil was really a pilot. But he calmly said that he had shot down more than 50 enemy planes. And then Rosen Walker wondered why the man was so frightened at that moment. And then Henry Revil said that he once had an older sister and a brother-in-law, and they were the parents of his niece. After that, the man asked if the protagonist knew about the bombing in Raritan, but she calmly explained that of course she knew about it. And then the guy asked if she was in that city that day. She was in the middle of her escape from prison and had been in Al Carpets for a long time after hearing the news. And all she knew was that she had overheard someone saying that Raritan had disappeared from the face of the earth. And then Henry Revil, with the most serious face possible, said that his elder sister was in that city that day, and also his niece was with her. And then she had just recently been born. At this time, the protagonist thought about the fact that when she first heard the news about the disappearance of Raritan, she did not believe it because it was a huge city, and she did not believe that it could disappear in just one morning. But at this point, Henry Revil reported that ironically, he was unable to prevent it, even though he knew his sister and Lilo were in the city at the moment, and he was unable to stop the bombing. And the protagonist just thought about the fact that it had nothing to do with her and she didn't want to hear it anymore, because it was Blood City, whether it disappeared or not. But she was interested in Henry Revil, and she didn't understand why he had suddenly stopped talking. Then Henry Revil went on and said that on that day, while flying, they had discovered an enemy formation. And then in horror, Henry Revil did not understand how they could deal with such a huge number of opponents at once. Then their enemies split into two groups, and the first group went to the Melon, and the rest of them to Raritan. Malone was the capital of their empire, and he, along with Sir Anne Connor, had to make an election. And then that election was taken over by Anne Connor, who reported that they were to defend the capital. Reflecting on this, Henry Revil reported that he didn't blame Anne Connor for it, because he had made the right choice, and he didn't blame him because it wouldn't have helped anyway.